There's a moment that comes for almost everyone. A moment where you have to decide, do I hold my ground here, or do I let this go? Maybe it's a job that's asking you to compromise something you said you'd never compromise. Maybe it's a friendship where you keep swallowing disrespect because you don't want to make it a thing. Maybe it's a belief you grew up with, and everyone around you is quietly moving on from it, and you're the only one still standing there, wondering if you're being strong or just stubborn. That question, am I being principled, or am I just being proud, is one of the hardest questions a person can ask themselves, because pride is a master of disguise. It dresses up in the clothes of integrity. It tells you you're standing for something when really, you just don't want to admit you're scared, or wrong, or both. 2,000 years ago, a Roman senator faced this question in its most extreme form. Not should I speak up in a meeting, not should I set a boundary with a friend. His version of the question was, the most powerful man in the world is offering me my life back, do I take it, or do I refuse it and die on my own terms? His name was Cato, and what he chose, and more importantly, how he knew it was the right choice, is one of the most useful stories in all of Stoic philosophy, because by the end of this video, you're not just going to know what Cato did, you're going to have an actual working test, one you can run in your own head, for telling the difference between principle and pride in your job, in your relationships, in what you believe. Something you can use this week. Before we get into it, if you're new here, this channel is where we take Stoic philosophy and strip away the toga and marble statue version of it, and just ask, what does this actually mean for someone living in ordinary modern life? If that's useful to you, subscribing costs nothing and it tells me to keep making these. Now let's go back to Rome. To understand Cato's final stand, you have to understand what kind of man he was long before that final day, because his death only means something if you understand the life that led up to it. Marcus Porcius Cato, known to history as Cato the Younger, to distinguish him from his equally stubborn great-grandfather, was born into Rome that was already sick, not sick with disease, sick with ambition. The republic that Rome had built, with its checks on power, its senate, its idea that no one man should rule alone, that the republic was rotting from the inside. Generals were becoming more powerful than the state itself. Bribery ran the elections. Political violence was becoming normal in the streets of the city. Everyone could feel that something was ending, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. And into that world stepped Cato, a man who seemed almost engineered to be inconvenient. As a young man, he was already known for something strange. He could not be bought. In a Rome where bribery was just how business got done, where you paid for votes, paid for favors, paid to make problems disappear, Cato refused, every time. Without exception, he walked around the city, sometimes without the toga that marked his rank, on foot instead of by litter, just to remind people, including himself, that he wasn't better than the ordinary Roman citizen he claimed to represent. He drank the same wine, ate the same plain food he'd have eaten as a soldier. Some people thought this was a performance. It wasn't. It was training. Cato treated comfort itself as something to be resisted, not because comfort is evil, but because a man who needs comfort can be controlled by whoever supplies it. He wanted to be a man who needed nothing from anyone, because the moment you need something, someone else has leverage over you. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it explains everything that comes later. Cato wasn't just disciplined for the sake of discipline. He understood something a lot of people never learn. The people who can hurt you politically, professionally, socially, they can only hurt you through what you're attached to. Take away the attachment, and you take away their power. So when Cato entered public life, he entered it as a man almost nothing could bribe, threaten, or seduce, and Rome, at that exact moment in history, had exactly one problem that mattered more than any other. A general named Julius Caesar. Caesar was everything Cato distrusted. Brilliant, charismatic, endlessly ambitious, and in Cato's eyes building himself into something the Republic was never supposed to allow. A single man with more loyalty from his soldiers than the Senate itself commanded. Caesar conquered Gaul and made himself a legend. He crossed the Rubicon, a river that, by law, no general was allowed to cross with his army still under arms, because doing so was a direct declaration that he intended to seize Rome by force rather than through the Senate. And when he did, most of Rome's leading men did what people in danger usually do. They calculated. They hedged. Some quietly reached out to Caesar to make sure they'd be safe either way. Others convinced themselves that resistance was pointless, that this was simply how history moved now, and there was no shame in bending with it. Cato did not hedge. He'd spent his entire career decades of speeches, decades of political battles, decades of making himself unpopular by refusing convenient compromises opposing exactly this outcome. One man holding power that belonged to the whole republic. And when the moment came where everyone else in Rome was recalculating what they believed based on who was about to win, Cato didn't recalculate anything. He picked up the fight on the losing side. In a civil war he almost certainly knew Rome would lose. This matters. Cato did not choose the losing side by accident, or out of blind loyalty to a person. He was never even particularly close with Pompey, the general who led the resistance against Caesar. The two of them had clashed for years. Cato joined that side anyway, because it was the side still nominally defending the Republic. And the Republic was the thing he actually believed in. Not a person, not a faction, an idea about how power should work. He fought. He organized supply lines in brutal conditions in North Africa, marching his soldiers on foot alongside them rather than riding, refusing privileges even in war. And eventually, inevitably, the war was lost. Caesar's forces won the decisive battle. The cause Cato had given his whole life to was finished. Cato retreated to the city of Utica in North Africa, with what remained of his men and the local citizens who'd sided with him. And there, word reached him. Caesar was coming. But Caesar was not coming for slaughter. Caesar, in fact, was known for something almost nobody expected from a conqueror. He was famous for his clemency. Enemy after enemy who had fought against him, including men who'd insulted him personally, were pardoned. Caesar wanted to be seen as merciful. He wanted men like Cato respected, principled, impossible to buy, walking around Rome very much alive, very much pardoned, very much a living symbol that Caesar was generous even to his enemies. And this is the moment the entire story turns on, because Caesar's pardon was not a small thing. It was, in practical terms, an escape hatch. Cato could live. He could go home. He was still relatively young. He had a family, a son, a household, and people who needed him. All he had to do was accept a mercy that was being offered freely, with no conditions attached, from a man who genuinely wanted to give it to him. Almost anyone would have taken it. Most of Rome already had. Cato spent his final night doing something that tells you everything about how he thought. He didn't spend it in panic, or in negotiation, or in a last desperate letter trying to change Caesar's mind. He had dinner with his friends and his officers, and the conversation turned as dinner conversations with philosophically minded Romans often did to Stoic ideas about virtue and about freedom, specifically the idea that no man is free who fears death, and no man is truly enslaved who does not fear it. Cato spoke calmly. Some of the men at the table grew uneasy, sensing where this was heading, and quietly moved to hide his sword. He noticed, and simply asked for it back, and got it, because no one wanted to openly accuse him of what they suspected. Then he went to his room and read, not scripture, not a farewell letter, a copy of Plato's Phaedo, the dialogue about Socrates' final hours, about the death of Socrates, and about why a soul that has lived rightly should not fear the end of the body. He read it once through. Then, it said, he read it again. And in the early hours of the morning, Cato took his own life rather than live under a power he believed was illegitimate, rather than owe his life to a mercy that would mean quietly accepting that the Republic was dead and Caesar was now, in effect, its master. When word reached Caesar, it said he responded not with satisfaction, but something closer to frustration. Cato, I begrudge you your death. He reportedly said, as you begrudged me the honor of saving your life. Even Caesar understood what had just happened. He had wanted Cato alive, pardoned, a walking proof of his own generosity. Cato had denied him that not out of spite, but because accepting would have meant becoming something he could not live as. He would rather stop living than live, as a symbol of the thing he'd spent his life fighting against. That's the story. A man who built a life of discipline, specifically so that no one could ever hold anything over him, and who, at the very end, proved it was real by refusing the one thing almost every person in his position would have taken without a second thought. Now here's the question that actually matters for you and me, sitting here 2,000 years later, with none of Cato's stakes and all of the same instinct toward pride, dressed up as principle. How do you know, in your own much smaller moments, whether you're being Cato or whether you're just being stubborn and calling it integrity? That's what we're breaking down next. So Cato had his answer. He was principled, not proud, and we can look back with 2,000 years of hindsight and mostly agree on that. But here's the harder truth. Cato didn't have the benefit of hindsight. He had to answer that question in real time, the same way you and I do. And most of us will never face Caesar. We won't be offered a pardon by a conqueror. Our version of this moment is smaller, quieter, And honestly, that makes it harder to see clearly because small stakes hide big self-deception really well. So let's take what Cato's life actually shows us and turn it into something you can use for questions, not history. A test one you can run silently, in your own head, the next time you're standing in front of a decision and telling yourself you're holding your ground. Cato refused Caesar's pardon knowing full well there'd be no crowd watching, no applause, no audience to perform for. In fact, quite the opposite, the men around him tried to talk him out of it. If he'd wanted a show, he had every opportunity to make his death loud, public, theatrical. He didn't. He had dinner. He read a book. He did it alone, before sunrise. That's the tell. Pride needs a witness. Principle doesn't care if anyone's ever going to hear about it. Bring that into your actual life. Say you're at work, and your manager makes a decision you think is wrong, and you're debating whether to push back in the team meeting. Ask yourself honestly, if nobody else was in that meeting, if it was just you and your manager, no audience, no coworkers watching to see if you're someone who speaks up, would you still say something? If the honest answer is yes, that's the principle. If the honest answer is well, it matters more because everyone's watching. That's not about the issue anymore. That's about how you look defending the issue. And those are two completely different things wearing the same outfit. Same test, social life. You're in a group chat, and a friend says something you disagree with, and you're deciding whether to challenge it right there in front of everyone. Would you still care enough to say something if it was a private message? Just the two of you, nobody else seeing you take the stand? Or does the urge to respond get louder specifically because other people are reading along? A lot of what looks like I don't let disrespect slide is actually I don't let disrespect slide when there's an audience for my comeback. Cato's test cuts right through that. Same test again, with belief. Maybe you hold a value religious, political, personal, that's become unfashionable among your friends or online. Ask yourself, do I hold this quietly, the same way, when no one's around to see me hold it? Or is some of the intensity of defending it actually about being seen defending it? Real conviction looks the same whether it's being watched or not. This is the most important question of all four, so it's worth slowing down on. Cato asked himself, in effect, if I accept this pardon, what breaks? And the honest answer wasn't my pride breaks. The honest answer was, the entire meaning of everything I've done for the last 30 years breaks. Accepting the pardon meant quietly agreeing that one man was now allowed to rule Rome by force. That wasn't a personal insult to Cato. That was the actual thing he'd spent his life opposing, now happening, with his own signature on the acceptance. So the question to ask yourself is brutally simple. If I let this go, what actually breaks? Not what feels uncomfortable, not what stings. What breaks? At work you're asked to fudge a number on a report. Just slightly, just this once. Nobody will ever know. What breaks if you do it? Maybe nothing tangible breaks today, but be honest with yourself about what breaks over time. Your own standard for what you're willing to put your name on. That's not nothing. That's the whole foundation you're building a reputation and a career on. That's worth defending. Compare that to a different work situation. Your manager wants the report formatted a way you personally think is worse, but it's not dishonest. It's just not how you'd have done it. What breaks if you let that go? Nothing. Your preference gets overridden. That's not a principle under threat. That's just Tuesday. Most workplace friction is actually this second kind, dressed up to feel like the first kind, because losing an argument stings regardless of what the argument was about. Socially, a friend cancels on you at the last minute for the third time. What breaks if you say nothing? Your own sense that your time matters. That's real. That's worth naming, calmly, without turning it into a whole confrontation. Now compare. A friend disagrees with your opinion on a movie, and you feel that flash of I need to win this. What actually breaks if you just let them have their opinion? Nothing. Nobody's respect for you hinges on you being right about a movie. With beliefs, someone challenges something you actually hold as core to who you are. Something that shapes how you treat people, how you raise your kids, what kind of person you're trying to be. What breaks if you just go quiet and let it slide? Your own integrity breaks a little every time you do that. That's worth holding your ground on, calmly and without needing to win the argument out loud. But if someone just has a different taste, a different style, a different harmless preference than you, nothing breaks if you let that be different. Not every disagreement is a hill. Cato picked exactly one hill in his entire life to die on. That's the model, not 10 hills a day. Here's something people miss about Cato's story. The final stand at Utica wasn't his first move. It was closer to his last. He'd spent decades in the Senate arguing, decades building alliances, decades trying to stop Caesar's rise through completely ordinary political means. Speeches, laws, elections, coalitions. He went to actual war before he ever got to the point of refusing a pardon. The dramatic final gesture only carries weight because of everything unglamorous that came before it. This is where a lot of people get the test backwards. They skip straight to the grand gesture, the dramatic resignation letter, the public call-out, the burned bridge without ever trying the boring version first. That's not principle. That's impatience wearing principle's clothes. At work, before you consider quitting over something you disagree with, have you actually raised it directly, calmly, more than once? Have you tried the conversation with your manager, the email laying out your concerns, the quieter attempt to change things from inside? Or did you go straight to the big gesture because the big gesture feels more satisfying than the slow, unglamorous work of actually trying to fix something? Cato didn't storm off from Rome the first time. Caesar did something he disagreed with. He stayed in the fight for years. The final stand meant something because he'd earned the right to make it. Socially, before you cut someone off completely, have you told them, in plain words, what's bothering you? Not hints, not distance, an actual conversation. A lot of people skip that step entirely and go straight to silence. Then call the silence boundaries. Sometimes it is a boundary. Often it's just avoiding wearing a more respectable name. With beliefs, before you go to war online defending a position, ask whether you've actually tried to understand the other side's reasoning first, or whether you jumped straight to defending your position because defending felt better than listening. Cato understood Caesar. He'd fought alongside and against plenty of complicated men in his life. His opposition wasn't reflexive, it was informed. Yours should be too. This is the final and, in some ways, simplest test. Not would letting this go be uncomfortable, because almost everything worth doing is uncomfortable. At some point, the real question is, would letting this go require me to pretend something is true that isn't? For Cato, accepting the pardon would have meant living the rest of his life pretending that Rome's freedom didn't matter as much as he'd always said it did. He would have had to lie to himself every single day just to be at peace with the choice. That's the line he wouldn't cross at work. This looks like would staying in this job under these conditions require you to keep telling yourself something you don't actually believe. This is fine. Everyone does this. It doesn't really matter when some part of you knows it does matter. That flinch, that small dishonesty, you have to keep repeating to yourself just to stay comfortable. That's the signal. Socially, it looks like would staying close to this person require you to keep explaining away behavior you'd never accept from anyone else. They don't mean it like that. That's just how they are. If you're building a small library of excuses just to keep the peace, you're not being tolerant. You're lying to yourself about what you're tolerating. With beliefs, it looks like would going along with the group here mean nodding at something you actually think is wrong just because disagreeing feels exhausting. There's a difference between genuinely updating your view because someone made a good point. That's not weakness. That's growth, and quietly going along with something while a part of you sits there knowing better. Cato never had to lie to himself about what he believed. That's what made his final choice so calm. There was no internal argument left to have. He'd already had it for years in public. Let's slow down and run one situation through all 4 tests at once, start to finish, so you can see exactly how this works in practice. Not for separate ideas, but one tool. Say you've been at a job for 2 years. Your manager asks you to take credit in a report going up to senior leadership for work that a junior colleague actually did. Nobody will ever know. Your manager frames it as just how these reports work. Leadership doesn't need every name, just a summary. And yours is the more senior name to put on it. It's a small task. It happens all the time apparently. You're annoyed, but you're also wondering, am I about to make this a whole thing over nothing? Am I being Cato here, or am I just being difficult? Run the 4 questions. Would you still refuse if nobody ever found out? Yes, actually, this is the clearest sign here. If your colleague never learned, their work got folded into your name. If leadership never knew. If there was 0 chance of embarrassment or consequence either way, you'd still feel wrong putting your name on someone else's work. That discomfort isn't about being caught. It's there even in total privacy. That's principle, not image management. What actually breaks if you let it go? Something real. Your colleague's visibility. Their shot at being noticed for good work. Maybe even their next promotion conversation. That's not an abstract principle, that's a specific person's career, quietly redirected toward you instead of them. That's worth naming. Have you tried everything else first? This is where you slow down before acting, before treating this as a hill to stand on. Have you asked your manager, plainly and without drama, whether both names could go on the report? Have you tried the boring, unglamorous version of a quick conversation before deciding this needs to become a bigger confrontation? If you haven't tried that yet, that's your actual next move, not a dramatic refusal. Would letting it go mean lying to yourself? Yes, you'd have to keep telling yourself it's not that deep every time you saw your colleague's work uncredited, when some part of you would always know exactly whose work it actually was. That small daily dishonesty is the real cost, more than any single report. Notice what happened there. The test didn't just tell you yes, take a stand, it also told you how to take it. Not a resignation letter, not a public call-out, a calm, direct conversation with your manager first, because you hadn't earned the bigger stand yet. That's Cato's whole pattern, just scaled down to office size, years of quiet, ordinary effort before anything dramatic, and the drama only shows up if the ordinary effort genuinely fails. That's the difference between running this test properly and just reacting on instinct. Instinct either caves immediately, it's fine, whatever, or explodes. Immediately I quit, this is disrespectful. The test slows you down long enough to find the actual right-sized response, which is usually somewhere quieter than either extreme. So here's the test again, quickly, because this is the part worth actually remembering. 1. Would you still do this if nobody ever found out? 2. What actually breaks if you let it go? 3. Have you tried everything else first? 4. Would letting go mean lying to yourself? Run those 4 questions honestly. And pride and principle stop looking so similar. Pride fails almost every one of them. It needs an audience. It protects your image, not your values. It skips the boring work and jumps straight to the dramatic gesture. And it requires you to keep telling yourself a story that isn't quite true. Principle, on the other hand, holds up in private, protects something bigger than you, comes after you've genuinely tried the alternative, and never asks you to lie to yourself to feel okay about it. Cato ran that test not in these words, but in his actions, and passed it completely. That's why his stand is still worth talking about 2,000 years later. Not because he died, but because of how clearly he knew it was the right thing to do. At the exact moment almost everyone around him was convincing themselves otherwise. You are almost certainly never going to face a Caesar, but you will face smaller versions of this same fork in the road. Probably this week at work, in a friendship, in something you believe that's inconvenient to hold on to right now. When you do, don't ask how do I win this. Ask the 4 questions. Let them tell you whether you're standing on solid ground, or just standing there out of pride. If this was useful to you, that's exactly what this channel is for, taking philosophy that's 2,000 years old and making it actually usable this week. If you got something out of this, hit like. It genuinely helps this reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of thing. And if you know someone who's stuck in one of these situations right now, the job, the friendship, the belief they're quietly defending, send them this video. It might be exactly what they need to hear today. Until next time, hold your ground. Just make sure it's actually yours to hold.